Section 5 of Inca Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Inca Lands by Hiram Bingham. Section 5. Chapter 3. To Parinacochas. After a few days, in the delightful climate of Chuquibamba, we set out for Parinacochas, the Flamingo Lake of the Incas. The late Sir Clements Markham, literary and historical successor of the author of The Conquest of Peru, had called attention to this unexplored lake in one of the publications of the Royal Geographical Society, and had named a bathymetric survey of Parinacochas as one of the principal desiderata for future exploration in Peru. So far as one could judge from the published maps, Parinacochas, although much smaller than Titicaca, was the largest body of water entirely in Peru. A thorough search of geographical literature failed to reveal anything regarding its depth. The only thing that seemed to be known about it was that it had no outlet. General William Miller, once British Consul General in Honolulu, who had as a young man assisted General San Martin in the wars for the independence of Chile and Peru, published his memoirs in London in 1828. During the campaigns against the Spanish forces in Peru, he had had occasion to see many out-of-the-way places in the interior. On one of his rough sketch maps he indicates the location of Lake Parinacochas, and notes the fact that the water is brackish. This statement of General Miller's, and a suggestion of Sir Clements Markham that a bathymetric survey of the lake would be an important contribution to geographical knowledge, was all that we were able to learn. Our arrieros, the Tejadas, had never been to Parinacochas, but knew in a general way its location and were not afraid to try to get there. Some of their friends had been there and come back alive. First, however, it was necessary for us to go to Cotahuasi, the capital of the province of Antabamba, and meet Dr. Bowman and Mr. Hendriksen, who had slowly been working their way across the Andes from the Urubamba Valley, and who would need a new supply of food boxes if they were to complete the geographical reconnaissance of the 73rd meridian. Our route led us out of the Chuquibamba Valley by a long, hard climb up the steep cliffs at its head, and then over the gently sloping, semi-arid desert in a northerly direction around the west flanks of Corupuna. When we stopped to make camp that night on the pampa of Chumpillo, our arrieros used dried moss and dung for fuel for the campfire. There was some bunch grass, and there were llamas pasturing on the plains. Near our tent were some Inca ruins, probably the dwelling of a shepherd chief, or possibly the remains of a temple described by Cieza de Leon (1519 1560), whose remarkable accounts of what he saw and learned in Peru during the time of the Pizarros are very highly regarded. He says that among the 5 most important temples in the land of the Incas was one much venerated and frequented by them, named Coropuna. It is on a very lofty mountain, which is covered with snow both in summer and winter. The kings of Peru visited this temple, making presents and offerings. It is held for certain, by treasure hunters, that among the gifts offered to this temple there were many loads of silver, gold, and precious stones, buried in places which are now unknown. The Indians concealed another great sum, which was for the service of the idol, and of the priests and virgins who attended upon it. But as there are great masses of snow, people do not ascend to the summit, nor is it known where these are hidden. This temple possessed many flocks, farms, and service of Indians. No one lives here now, but there are many flocks and llamas, and not far away we saw ancient storehouses and burial places. That night we suffered from intense cold, and were kept awake by the bitter wind which swept down from the snow fields of Coropuna, and shook the walls of our tent violently. The next day we crossed 2 small oases, little gulches watered from the melting snow of Coropuna. Here there was an abundance of peat and some small gnarled trees from which Chuquibamba derives part of its fuel supply. We climbed slowly around the lower spurs of Coropuna into a bleak desert wilderness of lava blocks and scoriaceous sand, the Red Desert, or Pampa Colorada. It is for the most part between 15,000 and 16,000 feet above sea level, and is bounded on the northwest by the canyon of the Rio Arma, 2,000 feet deep, where we made our camp and passed a more agreeable night. The following morning we climbed out again on the farther side of the canyon and skirted the eastern slopes of Mount Solimana. Soon the trail turned abruptly to the left, away from our old friend Coropuna. We wondered how long ago our mountain was an active volcano. Today, less than 200 miles south of here, are live peaks, like El Misti and Urbinas, which still smolder occasionally and have been known in the memory of man to give forth great showers of cinders covering a wide area. Possibly not so very long ago, the great truncated peak of Coropuna was formed by a last flickering of the ancient fires. Dr. Bowman says that the greater part of the vast accumulation of lavas and volcanic cinders in this vicinity goes far back to a period preceding the last glacial epoch. The enormous amount of erosion that has taken place in the adjacent canyons and the great numbers of strata, composed of lava flows, laid bare by the mighty streams of the glacial period, all point to this conclusion. My saddle mule was one of those cantankerous beasts that are gentle enough as long as they are allowed to have their own way. In her case, this meant that she was happy only when going along close to her friends in the caravan. If reined in, while I took some notes, she became very restive, finally whirling around, plunging and kicking. Contrariwise, no amount of spurring or lashing with a stout quirt availed to make her go ahead of her comrades. This morning I was particularly anxious to get a picture of our pack train jogging steadily along over the desert directly away from Coropuna. Since my mule would not gallop ahead, I had to dismount, run a couple of hundred yards ahead of the rapidly advancing animals, and take the picture before they reached me. We were now at an elevation of 16,000 feet above sea level. Yet to my surprise and delight I found that it was relatively as easy to run here as anywhere, so accustomed had my lungs and heart become to very rarefied air. Had I attempted such a strenuous feat at a similar altitude before climbing Coropuna, it would have been physically impossible. Anyone who has tried to run 200 yards at 3 miles above sea level will understand. We were still in a very arid region, mostly coarse black sand and pebbles, with typical desert shrubs and occasional bunches of tough grass. The slopes of Mount Solimana on our left were fairly well covered with sparse vegetation. Among the bushes we saw a number of vicuñas, the smallest wild camels of the New World. We tried in vain to get near enough for a photograph. They were extremely timid and scampered away before we were within 300 yards. 7 or 8 miles more of very gradual downward slope brought us suddenly and unexpectedly to the brink of a magnificent canyon, the densely populated valley of Cotahuasi. The walls of the canyon were covered with innumerable terraces, thousands of them. It seemed at first glance as though every available spot in the canyon had been either terraced or allotted to some compact little village. One could count more than a score of towns, including Cotahuasi itself, its long main street outlined by whitewashed houses. As we zigzagged down into the canyon, our road led us past hundreds of the artificial terraces and through little villages of thatched huts huddled together on spurs rescued from the all-embracing agriculture. After spending several weeks in a desert region where only the narrow valley bottoms showed any signs of cultivation, it seemed marvelous to observe the extent of which terracing had been carried on the side of the Cotahuasi Valley. Although we were now in the zone of light annual rains, it was evident from the extraordinary irrigation system that agriculture here depended very largely on ability to bring water down from the great mountains in the interior. Most of the terraces and irrigation canals were built centuries ago, long before the discovery of America. No part of the ancient civilization of Peru has been more admired than the development of agriculture. Mr. Cook says that there is no part of the world in which more pains have been taken to raise crops where nature made it hard for them to be planted. In other countries, to be sure, we find reclamation projects, where irrigation canals serve to bring water long distances to be used on arid but fruitful soil. We also find great fertilizer factories turning out, according to proper chemical formula, the needed constituents to furnish impoverished soils with the necessary materials for plant growth. We find man overcoming many obstacles in the way of transportation, in order to reach great regions where nature has provided fertile fields and made it easy to raise life-giving crops. Nowhere outside of Peru, either in historic or prehistoric times, does one find farmers spending incredible amounts of labor in actually creating arable fields, besides bringing the water to irrigate them and the guano to fertilize them. Yet that is what was done by the ancient highlanders of Peru. As they spread over a country in which the arable flat land was usually at so great an elevation as to be suitable for only the hardiest of root crops, like the white potato and the oca, they were driven to use narrow valley bottoms and steep, though fertile, slopes in order to raise the precious maize and many of the other temperate and tropical plants which they domesticated for food and medicinal purposes. They were constantly confronted by an extraordinary scarcity of soil. In the valley bottoms, torrential rivers, meandering from side to side, were engaged in an endless endeavor to tear away the arable land and bear it off to the sea. The slopes of the valleys were frequently so very steep as to discourage the most ardent modern agriculturalist. The farmer might wake up any morning to find that a heavy rain during the night had washed away a large part of his carefully planted fields. Consequently, there was developed, through the centuries, a series of stone-faced andenes, terraces or platforms. Examination of the ancient andenes discloses the fact that they were not made by simply hoeing in the earth from the hillside back of a carefully constructed stone wall. The space back of the walls was first filled in with coarse rocks, clay, and rubble. Then followed smaller rocks, pebbles, and gravel, which would serve to drain the subsoil. Finally, on top of all of this, and to a depth of 18 inches or so, was laid the finest soil they could procure. The result was the best possible field for intensive cultivation. It seems absolutely unbelievable that such an immense amount of pains should have been taken for such relatively small results. The need must have been very great. In many cases, the terraces are only a few feet wide, although hundreds of yards in length. Usually, they follow the natural contours of the valley. Sometimes they are 200 yards wide and a quarter of a mile long. Today, corn, barley, and alfalfa are grown on the terraces. Cotahuasi itself lies in the bottom of the valley, a pleasant place where one can purchase the most fragrant and highly prized of all Peruvian wines. The climate is agreeable, and has attracted many landlords whose estates lie chiefly on the bleak plateaus of the surrounding highlands, where shepherds tend flocks of llamas, sheep, and alpacas. We were cordially welcomed by Señor Vizcarra, the sub-prefect, and invited to stay at his house. He was a stranger to the locality, and, as the visible representative of a powerful and far-away central government, was none too popular with some of the people of his province. Very few residents of a provincial capital like Cotahuasi have ever been to Lima. Probably not a single member of the Lima government had ever been to Cotahuasi. Consequently, one could not expect to find much sympathy between the two. The difficulties of traveling in Peru are so great as to discourage pleasure trips. With our letters of introduction and the telegrams that had preceded us from the prefect at Arequipa, we were known to be friends of the government, and so were doubly welcome to the sub-prefect. By nature a kind and generous man, of more than usual education and intelligence, Señor Vizcarra showed himself most courteous and hospitable to us in every particular. In our honor he called together his friends, they brought pictures of Theodore Roosevelt and Elihu Root, and made a large American flag, a courtesy we deeply appreciated, even if the flag did have only 36 stars. Finally, they gave us a splendid banquet as a tribute of friendship for America. One day the sub-prefect offered to have his personal barber attend us. It was some time since Mr. Tucker and I had seen a barber's shop. The chances were that we should find none at Parinacochas. Consequently, we accepted with pleasure. When the barber arrived, closely guarded by a gendarme armed with a loaded rifle, we learned that he was a convict from the local jail. I did not like to ask the nature of his crime, but he looked like a murderer. When he unwrapped an ancient pair of clippers from an unspeakably soiled and oily rag, I wished I was in a position to decline to place myself under his ministrations. The sub-prefect, however, had been so kind and was so apologetic as to the inconveniences of the barber shop that there was nothing for it but to go bravely forward. Although it was unpleasant to have one's hair trimmed by an uncertain pair of rusty clippers, I could not help experiencing a feeling of relief that the convict did not have a pair of shears. He was working too near my jugular vein. Finally, the period of torture came to an end, and the prisoner accepted his fees with a profound salutation. We breathed sighs of relief, not unmixed with sympathy, as we saw him marched safely away by the gendarme. We had arrived in Cotahuasi almost simultaneously with Dr. Bowman and topographer Hendriksen. They had encountered extraordinary difficulties in carrying out the reconnaissance of the 73rd meridian, but were now past the worst of it. Their supplies were exhausted, so those which we had brought from Arequipa were doubly welcome. Mr. Watkins was assigned to assist Mr. Hendriksen, and a few days later Dr. Bowman started south to study the geology and geography of the desert. He took with him as escort Corporal Gamarra, who was only too glad to escape from the machinations of his enemies. It will be remembered that it was Gamarra who had successfully defended the Cotahuasi barracks and jail at the time of a revolutionary riot which occurred some months previous to our visit. The sub-prefect accompanied Dr. Bowman out of town. For Gamarra's sake they left the house at 3 o'clock in the morning, and our generous host agreed to ride with them until daybreak. In his important monograph, The Andes of Southern Peru, Dr. Bowman writes, "At 4 o'clock our whispered arrangements were made. We opened the gates noiselessly, and our small cavalcade hurried through the pitch-black streets of the town. The soldier rode ahead, his rifle across his saddle, and directly behind him rode the sub-prefect and myself. The pack mules were in the rear. We had almost reached the end of the street when a door opened suddenly and a shower of sparks flew out ahead of us. Instantly the soldier struck spurs into his mule and turned into a side street. The sub-prefect drew his horse back savagely, and when the next shower of sparks flew out, pushed me against the wall and whispered, 'For God's sake, who is it?' Then suddenly he shouted, 'Stop blowing! Stop blowing!' The cause of all the disturbance was a shabby, hard-working tailor who had gotten up at this unearthly hour to start his day's work by pressing clothes for some insistent customer. He had in his hand an ancient smoothing iron filled with live coals, on which he had been vigorously blowing. Hence the sparks. That a penitent tailor and his ancient goose should have been able to cause such terrific excitement at that hour in the morning would have interested our own Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was fond of referring to this picturesque apparatus and who might have written an appropriate essay on the goose that startled the soldier at Cotahuasi, with particular reference to his being a possible namesake of the geese that aroused the soldiers of ancient Rome. The most unusual industry of Cotahuasi is the weaving of rugs and carpets on vertical hand looms. The local carpet weavers make the warp and woof of woolen yarn in which loops of alpaca wool, black, gray, or white, are inserted to form the desired pattern. The loops are cut so as to form a deep pile. The result is a delightfully thick, warm, gray rug. Ordinarily, the native Peruvian rug has no pile. Probably the industry was brought from Europe by some Spaniards centuries ago. It seems to be restricted to this remote region. The rug makers are a small group of Indians who live outside the town, but who carry their hand looms from house to house as required. It is the custom for the person who desires a rug to buy the wool, supply the pattern, furnish the weaver with board, lodging, coca, tobacco, and wine, and watch the rug grow from day to day under the shelter of his own roof. The rug weavers are very clever in copying new patterns. Through the courtesy of Señor Viscara we eventually received several small rugs, woven especially for us from monogram designs drawn by Mr. Hendriksen. End of Section 5. Recording by William Tomko.